I have to go now, doll.
Write to me as soon as you get there.
Товарищи, обратите внимание на регулятор частоты. Это очень важно для связи на фронте.
Pay close attention to the frequency calibration here.
It is essential.
Pay attention. This sector is critical. We move at dawn, regardless of the weather. Ensure your platoons understand the new rendezvous points detailed here.
January 1945. Eastern Germany. Snow pressed flat against the frozen ground outside a converted military compound. Barbed wire cut dark lines through the white. Inside the wire, a small group of female prisoners stood waiting, coats too thin for the cold, faces drawn tight by months of captivity. They had been moved again, no explanation, no warning. Only orders. Across the yard, a building stood intact. Windows unbroken. Smoke rose steadily from its chimneys. Then the doors opened. Women stepped out. They were not prisoners. They wore pressed uniforms. Some carried folders. Others held notebooks under their arms. The prisoners watched as these women entered classrooms inside the compound. Chalkboards were visible through the glass. Rows of desks. Military diagrams already drawn in white lines. The women spoke with authority, gesturing, instructing unseen soldiers inside. For the prisoners, the moment landed without sound. In their world, women had been reduced to labor, survival, endurance. Here, women were shaping armies. The contrast was immediate and unsettling. It raised a question none of them could ignore. How had the same war produced captivity for some women and command over knowledge for others? That question did not begin in this courtyard. Its roots stretched back years. Before the war fractured Europe, the place of women in military life was narrowly defined. In most countries, armed forces were built on deeply rooted assumptions about gender. Men fought, men commanded, men trained. Women, when acknowledged at all, were positioned on the margins. Nurses, clerks, volunteers, auxiliaries. Their labor was considered supportive, not instructional. Essential, perhaps, but never authoritative. In the interwar years, this hierarchy was reinforced rather than challenged. Military academies across Europe remained closed institutions, bound to traditions that stretched back generations. Strategy, weapons handling, logistics, and doctrine were treated as male domains, passed from officer to officer through rigid educational systems. Even as women gained limited professional opportunities in civilian life, military education remained one of the most resistant spaces to change. Yet beneath this stability, pressure was already building. The First World War had left demographic scars that never fully healed. Millions of men had been lost. Birth rates fell. Entire age cohorts were thinned. Military planners were aware of it. They did not speak of it publicly, but personnel shortages were embedded in every forecast. The next war, if it came, would demand more than existing structures could provide. When war did come in September 1939, those predictions proved conservative. Within months, armies expanded at a scale unseen in European history. Germany mobilized millions. The Soviet Union began a vast reorganization of its forces. Britain and later the United States pulled entire societies into the war effort. Training systems strained under the volume. Schools ran continuously. Instructors were reassigned to combat units. Curricula were shortened. Standards were compressed. At first, the solution was temporary. Retired officers were recalled. Older veterans were placed behind lecterns instead of rifles. Civilians with technical backgrounds were contracted to teach engineering, communications, and mechanics. These measures delayed collapse, but they did not solve the underlying problem. The war was not static. It consumed manpower relentlessly. By 1941, the fronts had widened dramatically. Germany's invasion of the Soviet Union alone absorbed millions of men. Casualty lists grew longer each month. Instructors were no longer exempt. Training units were stripped to reinforce collapsing lines. Schools lost their most experienced personnel at the exact moment demand for trained soldiers surged. This is where ideology began to bend under necessity. In the Soviet Union, the shift came earliest and most visibly. Pre-war doctrine had already emphasized mass participation and technical education. As losses mounted in 1941 and 1942, women were drawn into roles previously considered unthinkable. They flew aircraft, operated artillery, served as snipers. Less visible, but equally significant, they entered training institutions. Many of these women were not improvisations. They had been engineers, teachers, mathematicians before the war. Some had military training from pre-war paramilitary programs. When male instructors were pulled to the front, these women did not simply fill space. They carried forward syllabi, standards, and doctrine that could not be allowed to fracture. Germany followed a different path, constrained by ideology, but driven by the same arithmetic. National Socialist doctrine publicly emphasized traditional gender roles, yet the war eroded those positions steadily. By 1943, the Reich faced a training crisis. The officer corps was bleeding. Technical branches, signals, logistics, anti-aircraft required instructors who understood complex systems. Women were already present as auxiliaries in these fields. Gradually, quietly, they were assigned instructional duties. Britain and the United States institutionalized the shift more openly. Women's auxiliary services expanded rapidly. By mid-war, women were instructing recruits in communications, navigation theory, aircraft recognition, code handling, and logistics administration. These are not symbolic roles. They shaped operational competence. They influenced outcomes at scale. All of this unfolded far from prisoner compounds. Female prisoners of war, whether captured as resistance members, auxiliary personnel, or civilians swept into occupation systems, experienced a different reality. Their status erased professional identity. Rank dissolved. Skill became irrelevant. Survival replaced specialization. For many, the idea that women elsewhere were teaching soldiers was not merely unknown. It was inconceivable. The war, however, was creating parallel worlds. In one, women stood in classrooms, translating doctrine into comprehension, turning civilians into soldiers. In the other, women stood behind wire, watching the war move forward without them. These worlds did not often intersect. When they did, the encounter carried a force that no ideology could soften. That intersection would become visible only later, when the machinery of war brought prisoners close enough to see how radically the rules had changed. And when that happened, the shock was not just personal. It was historical. By the middle years of the war, the conflict had crossed an invisible threshold. It was no longer a contest between armies alone. It had become a total war, drawing entire populations into its logic. Every factory, every classroom, every training ground was now part of the front. The distinction between combat and preparation blurred under the pressure of survival. This transformation reshaped military education first. Training establishments expanded at unprecedented speed. New schools appeared in requisitioned universities, factories, and civilian buildings. Curricula were redesigned to produce usable competence in weeks rather than years. The priority was no longer perfection, but continuity. Soldiers had to be trained faster than they were lost. This urgency created a simple problem with no ideological solution. There were not enough instructors. The depletion of experienced male personnel reached a critical point between 1942 and 1943. Instructors who had once been protected were now needed at the front. Their removal created gaps that could not be filled by tradition. They could only be filled by capability. Women, already embedded in auxiliary and technical roles, were the only available reservoir. In the Soviet Union, the process was direct and visible. Women were formally assigned as instructors in flight schools, artillery training centers, medical academies, and communications units. They taught aircraft mechanics, navigation theory, radio operation, and battlefield medicine. Many had completed accelerated officer training themselves. Their authority was codified, not improvised. This mattered. Military schools rely on legitimacy. Students must believe the instructor's knowledge is valid, transferable, and sanctioned. In the Soviet system, that sanction came from necessity backed by doctrine. The war demanded competence, and competence overrode gender. In the Western Allies, the shift took a bureaucratic form. Women in the Women's Auxiliary Air Force, the Women's Army Corps, and similar organizations were assigned instructional duties that mirrored civilian expertise. Mathematicians taught ballistics tables. Engineers taught radar theory. Linguists taught intelligence processing. The classroom became a space where pre-war professional boundaries dissolved. Germany's adaptation was slower, constrained by ideology, but accelerated by collapse. By 1944, training commands faced an unsustainable drain. Anti-aircraft units, signals schools, and logistics centers increasingly relied on women instructors, particularly in technical and administrative disciplines. These women did not wear the same rank insignia as combat officers, but within classrooms their authority was unquestioned. Lessons proceeded. Exams were administered. Standards were enforced. What distinguished this moment was not visibility, but permanence. Women were no longer temporary replacements. They became institutional memory. As male instructors rotated out, women preserved continuity. Lesson plans, technical manuals, evaluation systems. In some schools, they were the only instructors who remained long enough to see multiple training cycles through to completion. This reality remained largely hidden from those outside the system. Prisoners of war, especially women, existed beyond these institutional networks. Captivity isolated them not only physically, but informationally. News arrived distorted, delayed, or not at all. Official propaganda, when encountered, reinforced traditional narratives. Women were shown as victims, supporters, or symbols, not educators shaping military competence. This informational gap deepened the eventual shock. When female prisoners were transferred near training facilities, whether for labor, relocation, or administrative reasons, they sometimes glimpsed the machinery of instruction at work. They saw women writing on chalkboards, women correcting exercises, women addressing groups of uniformed men who listened, took notes, and followed orders. The sight contradicted everything captivity had taught them. For prisoners whose own identities had been stripped down to numbers, the image of women exercising intellectual authority inside the same war carried a quiet violence. It suggested that the war had not simply taken from them. It had redistributed power along lines they had not imagined. This was not a single revelation, but a pattern. Accounts from late-war Europe, particularly from the collapsing German rear areas and liberated eastern territories, record moments of stunned recognition. Female prisoners realized that while their world had narrowed, another had expanded. The war had fractured womanhood into radically different experiences, separated by geography, ideology, and fate. Those moments did not produce speeches or protests. They produced silence. And in that silence, a deeper understanding began to form, one that would be shaped by more than circumstance. It would be shaped by perspective, role, and the brutal arithmetic of war. That understanding would surface most clearly when the story is examined from multiple angles at once. For female prisoners of war, captivity was not only a physical condition. It was an erosion of identity carried out over time. Names were replaced by numbers. Professions dissolved into labor categories. Education, skill, and past achievement were rendered meaningless by the daily mechanics of survival. The war reduced them to bodies that could be moved, counted, and controlled. This process was deliberate. Captivity systems were designed to strip individuals of agency. Routine replaced choice. Orders replaced purpose. Even language was constrained. In this environment, self-concept narrowed until endurance itself became the only remaining marker of worth. For women, this erosion carried an additional layer. Many had already been defined by restrictive pre-war roles. Captivity pushed that compression to its limit. Against this background, the sight of women teaching in military schools landed with disproportionate force. The shock did not come from envy or resentment. It came from contradiction. Prisoners had internalized the logic of their captivity. They had learned, through repetition, that the war had no place for their autonomy. Yet here was evidence that the war had not erased women's authority everywhere. It had relocated it. Psychologically, this created dissonance. Survivor accounts describe the moment not as anger, but as a rupture in understanding. A woman behind wire watched another woman, similar in age, posture, and bearing, stand before a class of soldiers and instruct them. The instructor's voice carried certainty. Her movements were unhurried. She occupied space without apology. For the prisoner, the contrast was unbearable in its simplicity. One woman was confined because the war deemed her dangerous, expendable, or irrelevant. Another was empowered because the war deemed her necessary. The difference was not capability. It was context. This realization destabilized the mental framework that had sustained captivity. Many prisoners survived by accepting the inevitability of their situation. They told themselves that the war left no alternatives. Seeing women instructors contradicted that belief. It demonstrated that alternatives existed, just not for them. This recognition carried both pain and clarity. Some prisoners experienced a surge of shame, not because of their captivity, but because they had come to believe it defined womanhood in wartime. The image of women teaching soldiers shattered that illusion. It revealed that captivity was not a universal female fate. It was a contingent one. Others felt a more complex response, an uneasy mixture of admiration and grief. Admiration for what women could become under different circumstances. Grief for what had been denied to them. The two emotions did not cancel each other out. They coexisted, deepening the psychological weight of the moment. Importantly, this was not a political awakening in the conventional sense. Prisoners did not suddenly adopt new ideologies. The camps allowed little room for such transformations. Instead, the shift was internal. It altered how prisoners understood the war itself. They began to see the conflict less as a singular force and more as a system that distributed power unevenly. The war did not merely destroy. It selected. This selection extended beyond survival. It shaped whose knowledge mattered, whose voice carried authority, and whose labor was visible. For female prisoners, the realization was quietly devastating. It suggested that their exclusion was not an accident of war, but a consequence of how wartime systems classified value. This awareness also disrupted the emotional economy of captivity. Hope in prisoner environments was often carefully rationed. Too much hope invited despair. Too little led to collapse. The sight of women instructors complicated this balance. It offered proof that women could occupy meaningful roles within the war, yet it also reinforced the prisoner's distance from that reality. Some prisoners turned inward, retreating further from emotional engagement. Others clung more fiercely to memories of pre-war competence, recalling professions and skills they had been forced to abandon. In both cases, the encounter reshaped how they related to their own past and imagined their future. The psychological impact did not end with a moment of observation. It lingered. Long after the classroom doors closed, prisoners carried the image with them. It resurfaced during forced marches, in barracks at night, in moments of exhaustion when the mind searched for explanation. The image became a symbol, not of injustice alone, but of fragmentation. The war had splintered women's experiences so thoroughly that they could no longer be understood through a single narrative. This human angle reveals the depth of the shock described in post-war testimonies. It was not simply surprise at seeing women teach soldiers. It was the collapse of an assumption that the war had narrowed women's roles universally. It had not. It had widened them for some, while erasing them for others. That contrast, once seen, could not be unseen. And when examined beyond the personal, it opens the door to a broader understanding of how military systems, ideologies, and necessities interacted during the war. That broader picture emerges when the focus shifts from inner experience to structure and strategy. Beyond the personal shock experienced by female prisoners, the presence of women teaching in military schools reflected a deeper structural transformation within wartime systems. These changes were not driven by ideals of equality or reform. They were driven by necessity, measured in shortages, casualties, and timelines that no ideology could ignore. Military education is a conservative institution by design. It transmits doctrine, preserves continuity, and reduces uncertainty. Any change to who teaches soldiers carries implications far beyond the classroom. For women to appear as instructors meant that multiple layers of resistance had already collapsed. At the tactical level, the logic was straightforward. Modern war demanded technical competence. Radios had to function under pressure. Artillery calculations had to be precise. Aircraft recognition had to be instantaneous. These skills could not be improvised at the front. They had to be taught, practiced, and standardized before deployment. When trained male instructors were killed, wounded, or reassigned, the system faced a binary choice: adapt or fail. Women represented continuity. In many cases, women instructors were already embedded in the technical ecosystem of the war. They worked in signals offices, engineering bureaus, logistics centers, and medical institutions. When classrooms were stripped of male personnel, these women possessed the knowledge, documentation, and procedural familiarity needed to keep instruction moving. Their transition into teaching roles was not revolutionary. It was administrative. Yet administratively necessary changes often produce ideological consequences. For soldiers trained by women, authority was reframed through experience rather than doctrine. The classroom normalized female expertise in a way that propaganda never could. Instruction did not rely on symbolic gestures. It relied on results. Soldiers either learned or they did not. Equipment either functioned or it failed. In this environment, competence spoke louder than tradition. This normalization mattered. It meant that by the later years of the war, entire cohorts of soldiers had been shaped by women instructors without perceiving it as exceptional. The war accelerated exposure. What might have taken generations to normalize in peacetime occurred in months under wartime pressure. Ideologically, this created contradictions, especially in regimes that publicly reinforced traditional gender hierarchies. Germany's experience illustrates this tension. Official rhetoric continued to emphasize women's domestic roles, even as military institutions quietly relied on female instructors to maintain operational readiness. This disconnect was not resolved. It was concealed. Women taught because the system required it, not because ideology permitted it. The result was a silent expansion of female authority that existed without acknowledgement. For female prisoners observing this reality, the contradiction was stark. Captivity was often justified through ideological narratives: enemy status, political danger, racial classification. Yet within the same war, women of similar age and background were entrusted with shaping military outcomes. The system's internal logic became visible. Authority was not moral. It was functional. This functional logic also reshaped the moral dimension of warfare. When women taught soldiers, they became indirect participants in combat outcomes. Their instruction influenced accuracy, survival, and effectiveness. This blurred the line between combatant and non-combatant, a distinction already under strain in total war. The presence of women in classrooms underscored how deeply civilian boundaries had eroded. From the enemy's perspective, this had psychological implications. Intelligence reports from multiple theaters noted surprise at the extent of women's integration into training and support roles. For forces accustomed to rigid gender expectations, encountering women instructors disrupted assumptions about the opponent's resilience. It suggested depth, an ability to mobilize talent beyond conventional limits. For prisoners, especially those held by collapsing regimes, this realization carried a final layer of meaning. The system that held them captive was not only brutal, it was improvising. It was adapting in ways that contradicted its own stated values. The presence of women teaching soldiers signaled both strength and desperation. Strength, because the system could still function. Desperation, because it had no other choice. This duality sharpened the emotional impact of the encounter. Female prisoners were not simply witnessing progress or hypocrisy. They were witnessing a system under strain, revealing its true priorities under pressure. The war, stripped of rhetoric, valued effectiveness above all else. When viewed through this angle, the shock experienced by female POWs becomes more than a personal reaction. It becomes evidence of a broader historical shift, one in which authority, competence, and survival rearranged long-standing social hierarchies in real time. These shifts did not occur gradually. They were forced by crisis, accelerated by loss, and cemented by repetition. By the time prisoners glimpsed women teaching in military schools, the transformation was already embedded. What remained was the moment when this hidden reality became visible, when ideology gave way to experience, and assumption gave way to evidence. That moment would reach its sharpest intensity when circumstances brought prisoners even closer to the machinery of instruction itself, when observation turned into undeniable confirmation. This is where the narrative moves toward its decisive turning point. By late 1944 and early 1945, the geography of war compressed in on itself. Front lines shifted rapidly. Training centers once considered safely behind the lines found themselves exposed. Prisoner transfers accelerated as administrations attempted to stay ahead of advancing armies. In this chaos, boundaries that had once kept worlds separate began to collapse. It was during these movements that female prisoners came closest to the institutions that embodied the war's transformation. In Germany and occupied territories, labor details increasingly drew prisoners into proximity with military schools. Buildings once used for instruction were repurposed for storage, evacuation centers, or last-minute training. Prisoners were marched past them, housed nearby, or assigned to auxiliary work within their perimeters. For the first time, observation became sustained rather than accidental. Female prisoners saw schedules posted. They heard lectures through open windows. They watched instructors arrive and depart daily. The pattern was unmistakable. Women instructors were not anomalies. They were integrated. They possessed routines, authority, and continuity. Their presence did not provoke discussion or disruption among the soldiers they taught. Lessons proceeded. Discipline was enforced. The classroom functioned. For prisoners, this sustained exposure transformed shock into recognition. What had first appeared as an isolated contradiction now revealed itself as a system. Women were teaching not once, but repeatedly. Not in secret, but in the open. Not as emergencies, but as part of established procedure. This realization altered how prisoners interpreted their own captivity. Captivity had often been rationalized as a consequence of chaos, breakdown, or temporary necessity. The orderly operation of military schools contradicted that narrative. The war, at least in these spaces, still possessed structure. Decisions were still being made. Authority was still being assigned deliberately. This made captivity feel less accidental and more intentional. Accounts from liberated prisoners describe a quiet internal shift during this period. There was no outward confrontation. Guards remained guards. Orders remained orders. But internally, something hardened. Prisoners understood that the war had not stripped the system of choice. It had redirected choice elsewhere. This recognition coincided with other signs of collapse. By 1945, soldiers in training units were often younger, less prepared, and visibly exhausted. Instruction was condensed further. Errors increased. Yet the presence of women instructors remained constant. In some cases, They were the most experienced personnel left in the institution. Prisoners noticed this disparity. They saw women who had been teaching for months or years, now instructing increasingly desperate cohorts of recruits. The instructor's composure contrasted sharply with the surrounding instability. It suggested that while fronts collapsed, knowledge had to persist. This persistence reframed the war in the prisoners' minds. The war was no longer just violence and deprivation. It was also continuity under strain. The classroom became a symbol of that continuity, one maintained, in part, by women whose authority had been quietly normalized. The decisive emotional moment came not from spectacle, but from confirmation. When prisoners overheard instructions given with confidence, when they saw soldiers take notes from women without hesitation, when they watched evaluations conducted and standards enforced. These are not gestures. They were functions. For women whose own capabilities have been rendered invisible, this was the moment when denial collapsed. The war had room for female authority. It simply had not made room for them. That understanding did not produce rage. It produced clarity. Prisoners began to see their experiences not as personal failure or misfortune, but as outcomes shaped by structures beyond their control. This reframing offered a paradoxical relief. It restored dignity, even as it deepened grief. The turning point, then, was not a single encounter. It was accumulation. Observation layered upon observation until doubt was no longer possible. By the time liberation approached, many female prisoners carried with them a sharpened awareness of how unevenly the war had distributed power, opportunity, and recognition among women themselves. This awareness would not disappear with the end of captivity. It would follow them into liberation, into testimony, into memory, shaping how the war would later be remembered and recorded. And yet, the recognition was not complete. Understanding the full weight of what they had witnessed required confronting the broader implications, what it meant not just for them, but for the war's outcome and the world that followed. That deeper reckoning would emerge as the war moved into its final phase. As the war entered its final months, certainty collapsed faster than infrastructure. Orders contradicted one another. Evacuations reversed direction. Training schedules shortened to days. In this atmosphere of unraveling control, the presence of women teaching soldiers took on a new meaning for those watching from captivity. What had once seemed exceptional now appeared foundational. Female prisoners, moved repeatedly as territories fell, encountered the same pattern in different locations. Different uniforms, different languages, the same dynamic. Women standing before soldiers, transmitting knowledge the war could not afford to lose. Repetition removed doubt. This was no longer about isolated policies or desperate improvisation. It was about how modern war functioned when stripped to its essentials. Whoever possessed knowledge and could transmit it held power. For prisoners who had been systematically denied recognition of their own skills, this realization landed with finality. The war had not erased women's intellectual authority. It had selectively applied it. This selective application exposed the limits of ideology. In regimes that had loudly proclaimed rigid gender roles, reality now spoke more clearly than doctrine. When survival was at stake, competence overruled belief. Women taught because soldiers needed instruction. The war did not debate the issue. It enacted it. This confrontation between belief and necessity crystallized in the minds of prisoners. They had been told implicitly and explicitly that their captivity reflected something inherent about them, their danger, their inferiority, their expendability. Watching women exercise authority within the same system revealed that those narratives were tools, not truths. This was the moment assumptions broke. The emotional impact was quiet but irreversible. Prisoners describe a sense of emotional distance setting in, a protective detachment. They no longer sought explanations rooted in morality or fairness. They recognized the war as a mechanism, indifferent to justice and responsive only to utility. This recognition also altered how prisoners perceived liberation. As Allied forces approached, and camps began to dissolve, the image of women teaching soldiers did not fade. It accompanied prisoners into freedom, complicating simple narratives of victory and defeat. Liberation restored agency, but it did not erase the knowledge of how unevenly that agency had been distributed during the war. The turning point, then, extended beyond captivity itself. It reshaped how former prisoners interpreted the post-war world. They had seen proof that women could hold authority under extreme conditions. They had also seen how easily systems could deny that authority when convenient. This dual insight would influence post-war testimony. In memoirs, interviews, and oral histories, former female POWs often returned to these moments not as anecdotes, but as markers of understanding. They described them as times when the war revealed itself plainly, stripped of rhetoric, operating on function alone. The image of women instructors became symbolic. It represented what the war demanded, not what it claimed to believe. It exposed the gap between official narratives and lived reality. And for those who had endured captivity, it clarified that their suffering existed alongside, not instead of, female empowerment elsewhere. This realization did not diminish their experience. It contextualized it. By the time the war ended, the moment had passed. Camps emptied, schools closed or transitioned. Soldiers returned home. Yet the memory remained fixed, because it marked the instant when prisoners understood the war not as a moral drama, but as a system that rearranged human roles under pressure. That understanding did not end with the war. It flowed into the aftermath, into how nations accounted for victory, how women's contributions were recognized or forgotten, and how the legacy of wartime necessity was managed once survival was no longer at stake. The consequences of that wartime rearrangement would shape military institutions and historical memory long after the last classroom fell silent. And it is in those consequences that the story now continues. The end of the war arrived unevenly. Some camps were liberated in days of chaos. Others dissolved slowly as guards fled and administrative structures collapsed. For female prisoners, freedom came with exhaustion rather than celebration. Bodies were weakened. Records were incomplete. Identities had to be reconstructed piece by piece. Amid this process, the images carried from captivity did not disappear. Former prisoners re-entered societies that were eager to restore normalcy. Military institutions demobilized rapidly. Training schools closed or returned to peacetime functions. Women instructors were thanked, reassigned, or quietly dismissed as men returned from the front. The shift was swift. In many countries, the same institutions that had relied on women's authority during the war now moved to reassert pre-war hierarchies. Teaching posts reverted to men. Women were encouraged to return to civilian roles. The extraordinary became temporary, framed as a wartime exception rather than a structural change. For former prisoners, this reversal was unsettling. They had witnessed the war strip ideology of its illusions. They had seen women exercise authority, not symbolically, but functionally. Watching that authority dissolve in peacetime revealed a new contradiction, one that suggested the war's lessons would not be fully absorbed. This did not provoke public confrontation. Post-war societies were consumed with rebuilding. Testimony from female POWs focused on survival, deprivation, and loss. The subtler observations of classrooms, instructors, authority often remained secondary, embedded in longer narratives or recalled only later. Yet their significance endured. In the immediate aftermath, military reports and internal assessments acknowledged women's instructional contributions in technical fields. These acknowledgments were often confined to archives rather than public memory. The narrative of victory centered on combat, leadership, and sacrifice, domains still coded as male. The consequence was selective remembrance. Women who had taught soldiers shaped outcomes indirectly but decisively. Their students survived or failed based on what they had learned. Yet once the war ended, the machinery of recognition shifted away from preparation toward action. For former prisoners, this reinforced a pattern they had already recognized. The war had been capable of redistributing authority when forced to do so. Peace restored the power to choose, and institutions chose familiarity. This did not erase what had occurred, but it reframed it as an anomaly. Liberation also brought new forms of silence. Many former female POWs returned to societies that lacked frameworks for understanding their experience. They had endured captivity while other women exercised authority within the war effort. Both experiences were true, yet rarely discussed together. The complexity did not fit simplified narratives of victimhood or empowerment. This fragmentation shaped early historical accounts. Memoirs written in the immediate post-war years often focused on endurance rather than observation. The psychological shock of witnessing women teach soldiers surfaced more clearly in later reflections, when distance allowed interpretation rather than survival. Even so, the immediate consequence of the wartime transformation was not reform. It was retraction. Military education systems absorbed the lessons quietly. Training methods improved. Technical curricula expanded. But the visibility of women within those systems diminished as peacetime norms reasserted themselves. The aftermath, then, was defined by contrast. The war had demonstrated what was possible under pressure. The peace that followed chose what was comfortable instead. For those who had seen both captivity and authority coexist within the same conflict, this choice carried lasting weight. It underscored a final truth learned during the war. Systems change when forced and revert when allowed. Understanding how that reversion shaped long-term memory and institutional development requires stepping beyond the immediate aftermath and into the slower reckoning that followed. That reckoning would determine which wartime realities endured and which faded into the margins of history. In the years that followed the war, memory hardened into narrative. Governments commemorated victory. Military institutions codified lessons learned. Societies sought coherence after rupture. Within this process, the wartime presence of women as military instructors receded from public view, absorbed into broader stories of mobilization without sustained examination. For former female prisoners of war, this silence was familiar. Their own experiences struggled for recognition alongside dominant narratives of heroism and battlefield sacrifice. Yet as historians, sociologists, and military analysts revisited the war with distance, fragments of a more complex picture began to surface. Archival records revealed training rosters listing women as instructors in communications, aviation theory, medical education, and logistics. Personnel files documented women who had taught successive cohorts of recruits while fronts advanced and collapsed. Oral histories recorded students recalling instructors who were women, not as anomalies, but as fixtures of wartime education. These materials confirmed what prisoners had witnessed. The war had produced a functional redistribution of authority. Women had not merely assisted the war effort. They had sustained its intellectual infrastructure during its most vulnerable moments. This recognition emerged slowly and unevenly. In the Soviet Union, wartime integration of women into military roles received official acknowledgement earlier, aligned with ideological narratives of collective sacrifice. Even there, however, the instructional contributions of women were often subsumed under broader categories, lacking individual visibility. In Western countries, reassessment came later. The Cold War reshaped military priorities. Training systems professionalized. Technical expertise became central to modern armed forces. In this environment, the wartime precedent of women teaching soldiers quietly informed policy debates about recruitment, education, and specialization, even when not explicitly cited. For former prisoners, these developments carried a muted validation. The shock they had experienced during captivity, the realization that women could and did hold authority within the war, was no longer merely personal. It had historical corroboration. What they had seen was real, systematic, and consequential. Yet recognition did not erase disparity. Post-war societies continue to struggle with integrating women into positions of military authority. Progress occurred unevenly, often framed as innovation rather than continuity. The wartime classroom was rarely acknowledged as a precursor. Instead, change was narrated as beginning later, detached from the emergency-driven adaptations of the 1940s. This disconnect shaped historical memory. The experiences of female POWs and women instructors existed in parallel archives, rarely intersecting. One documented suffering, the other documented service. The war, however, had bound these experiences together within the same system, one that could empower and imprison simultaneously. Understanding this duality complicates simple interpretations of progress. The war did not advance women's roles out of conviction. It advanced them out of necessity. When necessity faded, so did institutional commitment. What remained were traces, policies informed by experience, attitudes altered by exposure, and memories carried by those who had seen the system operate under extreme pressure. For history, this matters. It reminds us that structural change often occurs before recognition, and that lived experience can precede formal acknowledgement by decades. Female prisoners who witnessed women teaching soldiers understood this intuitively. They had seen evidence of capability denied and authority selectively granted. Their testimony adds depth to the historical record. It shows the war not as a uniform force, but as a mechanism that fractured experience along lines of access, location, and utility. It reveals how power moved through institutions even as individuals were constrained by them. This long-term perspective does not resolve the contradictions exposed by the war. It preserves them, and in preserving them, it prepares the ground for reflection, not on what the war claimed to represent, but on what it revealed when survival stripped systems to their core. That reflection forms the final movement of this story. The war did not speak in ideals. It spoke in requirements. When survival became the only measure, institutions abandoned certainty and clung to function. Classrooms continued because they had to. Knowledge moved because it could not stop. Authority settled where competence was available, regardless of who carried it. For female prisoners of war, the sight of women teaching soldiers revealed this truth with painful clarity. It showed that the limits imposed on them were not natural nor inevitable. They were situational, chosen, enforced. The war had created two realities at once. In one, women were confined, stripped of agency, and reduced to endurance. In the other, women stood before soldiers, shaping decisions that would determine who lived and who did not. Both realities existed within the same conflict, governed by the same systems. This contradiction was not resolved when the war ended. Peace restored the power to choose, and institutions chose familiarity. The extraordinary was labeled temporary. The lessons learned under pressure were archived rather than embraced. Yet the evidence remained, carried in records, in testimony, and in memory. What female prisoners witnessed was not a promise fulfilled, but a capability exposed. It demonstrated that authority is not granted by tradition, but by need. Though when systems are forced to reveal their true priorities, they often contradict their own narratives. And that progress born of crisis does not guarantee permanence once the crisis fades. The war rearranged human roles without apology. It empowered and erased with equal efficiency. For those who saw both sides, captivity and authority, it offered no simple moral, only understanding. That understanding endures as a reminder that history is shaped not only by what is proclaimed, but by what is practiced when survival is at stake. And that the most revealing moments of war are often quiet ones. When a prisoner pauses, looks through a window, and sees the world operating by rules she was never meant to access. In that moment, the war reveals itself completely.